moving beyond the familiar Cartesian cogito with, it seems, devaluation of all but consciousness, the body, the collective, nature, the unconscious. He has attempted to engage the left out within clinical work and teaching. And now he's exploring a different starting point, a variation on Ubuntu. Because we are loved, we exist. I love, therefore I am. For us Jungians, he proposes this as an umbilicus for our work, for our existence in action.
Thank you and good morning. This presentation, Blind Spots of the Western Mentality, Impositionalism Opposed to Universalism, is inspired by and offered with gratitude for the work of our Brazilian colleague, Roberto Gambini. Our gestalt, my view. The notion of Western mentality or Western attitude manifests within each of us as a highly complex field, gargantuan, multivalenced, betrayed by blindness, betraying in its blindness, and yet. This resembles our continuous struggle vis-a-vis, for example, white male unconsciousness within both our lives of analysts and our training institutes and unwitting traditions. As Jungians, more particularly, we know the brilliance of Jung's work and the ubiquitous threads of European white superiority in his comments about Africa, India, and other cultures. His thoughts originate within an insulating detachment, filled with fears of going black, of going unconscious, of becoming the esteemed primitive who cannot think. Even as he warns against the dreadful face of the invasive white man, Jung himself retreated to his ship in India's ports to be regrounded by his research on alchemy. Or he wakes up just in time from his curling haircut in Africa. My proposal. Respect and humility root the three nodes of my reflections. First, a former Jesuit, myself, I look into Gambini's Indian mirror to see what I find. Second, I reckoned with afflicted traditions of the Enlightenment as such and manifesting in the consulting room. Third, activated by the future and community and climate, I ask, what might Jungian theory offer? In brief, I'm proposing an attitude shift. I'm urging that the other, others, the so-called unconscious, nature, ourselves, existence, all are to be engaged as true equals, not something to be corrected. Indeed, there are awful problematics, including ourselves, but jointly held in a Betrachten-like interaction, nourishing gold will manifest. A gold, however, that is not our possession, rather one jointly known. We will end our explorations in a contemporary alchemical kitchen located at the Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar. A former Jesuit looks into Gambini's Indian mirror. Indian mirror is a masterful access point, especially for a Jesuit, a bit like being a Jungian. Resonances may evolve, but do not cease. Briefly, Gambini pens a reflective dialogue between his clinical work in Brazil with indigenous patients and the Jesuit journals regarding their encounter with and work in Brazil. In my Jesuit Brazil, I knew the glorious efforts of the Jesuits to protect and respect the dignity of the Indians, as epitomized in the movie, The Mission. Resistance fighters on behalf of the people they were working with and protecting. Ultimately, the Jesuits lost to the colonizing forces, leading both to their own exile and suppression and to the destruction of the protective missions they had established. In the non-movie version, Gambini's narrative, the Jesuits at their best were compromised by their own projections about differences, cultural, communal life, bodies, and beliefs. They less saw what was and more endeavored to save and protect what they projected. The Indians were to be saved by a truer religion, kept safe, as in keeping a so-called primitive or child safe. Gambini's a Terrena person, however, leaves him and us glimpsing our projections in the mirror as we hear the Terrena's dream. I went to the old Warnari cemetery at the reserve, and there I saw a large cross. Some white men arrived and nailed me upside down to the cross. They left and I remained desperate. I woke up very frightened. Similar problematics surround the Chilean celebratory story of Hanukkah, or the Argentinian story of Anahi, glorious national folk tales, but with amnesia regarding the undergirding stories of indigenous women oppressed, disappeared, not simply mythically transforming or becoming flowers. We need to suffer, to bear these voices of transgenerational collective trauma, very much a harmonic of the challenges George Floyd's murder laid bare in the United States, rather than indulge guilty, non-fruitful reflections on whiteness. They left and I remained desperate. I woke up very frightened. This evokes for me an archetypal image of the Apostle Peter, martyred but choosing to be hung upside down on a cross so as to not claim equality with the Messiah. This culturally valorized portrayal of Peter's death depicts the unreceived news of liberation within noble martyrdom, precisely mirroring what is attested to by the Terrena. The missionizing gospel became an instrument of torture. For instance, in my Jesuitness, post-Vatican II, late 1960s, liberation theology did not disclose my unconscious superior knowledge, or more insidiously, my participation in institutionally structured racism, including subsequent Jungian structures and valorized symbolic systems. Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, Frantz Fanon's writing on the invention of race as a defense against anxiety, later Jonathan Lear's radical hope, narrating the morning dreams of Plenty Coupe, the Crow people's leader, each stirred vicarious guilt. I ached, feeling Plenty Coupe's dreams in the face of the seemingly unsurvivable, the other decimation of the Crow people's history and culture intertwined with buffalo and territories, both taken away, forbidden. I was a good guy, working with First Peoples and Mexican Americans in the early 1970s, but with little awareness of my own, quote, superior knowledge, or institutional embeddedness, or highly compromised action. In the 272, a book, Rachel Swarns narrates the slow and excruciating working through of Jesuit Georgetown University's history of slaveholding and betrayal in order to survive for profit. It is as if the mission came home to bite the university in its voluntarily exposed butt. We know similar stories all throughout European, North American, Australian, that is to say, Western attitude cultures. I was reminded recently how Australia historically advertised itself to prospective immigrants, terra nullius, a land with no one or nothing of cultural value, an empty land belonging to no one, room for you. Whatever would be encountered was nullius, not one's equal, not human like us, had no inherent rights, and thus was there for the taking. Such is our problematic. Each of us, each of our societies, the IF as a whole, has its own similar shared cultural, intellectual, and historical reality, and the dilemmas embedded traditions and internalized complexes pose. How daunting it is to comprehend one's own institutionalized bedrock in practice, in training, in the mirror. As institutional bedrock, Sam Kimball's notes, not only are such collective cultural stories, but they also carry the ghost of our Jungian ancestors and mentors. Afflicted Facts, Part 2. Traditions of Enlightenment, Macroscopic and Consulting Room Vantages. Our Western attitude and its blind spots has evolved from many sources. In particular, I want to discuss aspects of enlightenment, thinking and dialogical approaches that move such thinking explicitly into the epistemologies of interaction, intersubjectivity, participatory thinking, mutuality. Consider Freire, mutuality, and our interpersonal world. For all his blind spots, Jung clinically was in the world of fields, intersubjectivity, participant observers, rather than that of a detached scientific attitude in which the knower knows from a neutral superior point of view, a bit like Freud's Darwinian scientific attitude in contrast with Einstein and theories of relativity. Simply put, Freire is correct in my opinion. We are co-learners. We are giving only as we are genuinely receiving. The student, the analysand, is not someone we are informing, correcting, training, filling up. Rather, we are in the bath of the treatment matrix together. Any other kind of learning, of analyzing, of training, is not liberating, but a fresh domination, a more enlightened knowledge as power strategy, not as obvious as Mao's dictum, power flows from the barrel of a gun, but just as lethal. Infant observation, the work of analysts such as Harry Stack Sullivan, Erik Erikson, Harold Searles, Donald Winnicott, all of these and more make clear that we are ever co-learners, co-participants. For instance, facing well after the fact that we therapists historically positioned patients as other, as inhabitants of the dark continent of unknown sexuality or non-sequential logic, we recognize somewhat that we have been occupants of our own, as Jung would put it, neurosis countertransferential island, or as Kimball would say, cultural complexes. I want to consider for a while Susan Neiman's helpful essay, Left is Not Woke. For Neiman, Foucault is incorrect. Questioning and enlightenment, whilst they may be subverted into strategies of power and colonization, intrinsically are not better methods of domination, but rather critiques, honoring universalism, justice, and the possibility of progress. As Jungians, we work interactively in a matrix, a field that transcends and contains both ourselves and our patients. We work with, within, not dominating the field or the other, rather embracing it. Indeed, we are sustained by the activated field, resting within its infiniteness, wherein there is enough. We cease needing, even if subtly, to dominate. Against twist on foundational biblical narratives in Genesis as created, we are part of a greater process. Falsely drawing upon some interpretations, we've identified ourselves as the apex of the process, having naming rights and domination, possessing the gold. Job, the person, and reflectively the people as a whole, in exile, realize, regardless of what has befallen them or us subjectively, which spawns our victimhood and ensuing tribalism, that they have, it is not their interior ego, it's their interior ego self that needs to awaken to the possibility that there is enough. There's a theology in the Bible that's referred to as Deuteronomic, and in it, one is to do good, and good will come to you. If ill is befallen you, you must have done ill. A post-Deuteronomic theology is revealed to Job. You could say a solace for a hitherto non-ego awareness in some mysterious Job-like way. We also, similarly, come to discover enough. Such awareness removes Job from victimhood and tribalism. Neiman articulates a similar stance when she posits, quotes, being a universalist allows you to find fascination and joy in all the ways people differ, and still come back, time and again, to the bones that build and bind us. It's the kind of compassion that Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued is prior to reason and found not just in humans, but in many animals. Universalism, she continues, is under fire on the left because it's identified and conflated with fake universalism, the attempt to impose certain cultures on others in the name of abstract humanity that turns out to reflect just a dominant culture's time, place, and interest. Viewing the world from the perspective of non-Westerners, Rousseau comments, "The whole earth is covered with nations of which we know only the names, and yet we pretend to judge mankind." Kant himself notes, "America, the lands inhabited by the Negro, the Spice Islands, the Cape, were at the time of their discovery by these civilized intruders as lands without owners, for they, the conquistadors, counted the inhabitants as nothing." Remember the Australian advertisement of itself as terra nullius. Contemporary philosopher Olufemi Otoyo suggests colonization was problematic because Enlightenment values were ignored. Where colonized peoples were concerned, Europeans discarded their own ideas of liberty, self-determination, government by the consent of the governed, and even humanity itself. Neiman observes we all have the ability to feel. We all feel pain. We all desire freedom. This contrasts utterly with what circulates within our familiar unconscious Western structures. Foucault, I think, identifies and valorizes those structures. In his words, all knowledge rests on injustice, that there is no right, not even in the act of knowing, to truth or a foundation for truth, and that the instinct for knowledge is malicious, something murderous, opposed to the happiness of mankind. Power is everywhere. Power produces reality. It produces domains of objects and rituals of truth. End of quote. Foucault, of course, is a well-deserved critique. Aspects of enlightenment, aspects of our work as Jungians, are self-serving, dominating, subtly rapacious, a sort of monster committed to subjugating nature, and with it indigenous peoples considered to be natural. But it is in itself committed to questioning European institutions, itself, received authority, small elites like Jesuits and Jungians. We do not have to continue, we could say, the false conclusions Luther arrived at, with power in which it was unthinkable that peasants and princes could stand anywhere on anything resembling equal footing. Freud's echoing Hobbes in the statement Homo homini lupus on civilization in its discontents emphasizes a view that's echoed in much of sociobiology. We do consider others, but only as such consideration improves our narcissistic aims. Jung's approach offers a liberation from such a view in practice and as a necessary given. We may move beyond our unwitting one-sidedness, our barely embraced birthright, born at one with and within an interactive culture, nature, one fueled more by love than power. The lyrics of a classic American musical, South Pacific, you've got to be taught, carefully taught, so that by 6 or 7 or 8 years you have learned to hate, suggest a clue, namely the interactive possibility that we know to be the fundamental of existence, loving relationality. The, so to speak, Ubuntu of existence, because we are, I am, or in French theologian Jean-Luc Marion's words, because I love, I am. That only slowly do I awaken to the depths of liberation psychoanalysis, indeed central to Jung, does not invalidate the possibility of working differently with and in the treatment matrix, in which indeed we are contained in the manifesting as greater than us, the mercurial fountain. Neiman concludes, because universalism has been abused to disguise particular interest, will you give up on universalism? Because claims of justice were sometimes veils for claims of power, will you abandon the search for justice? Because steps toward progress sometimes had dreadful consequences, will you cease to hope for progress? Similarly with us and with Jung, our many failures to face into our own shadow our subtle perpetuation of Jung's limits, our own partial realization of the potentials latent in Jung's understanding of the treatment matrix, each of these are only one side of our history and possibility. That is, as with all complexes, the opposite is active and activating. Last part. What might Jungian theory offer, activated by the future and community and climate? Aspects of Jung's work held together offer a dynamic elixir. First, Jung's analysis of the interactive mutuality of the treatment matrix. Second, Jung's often repeated awareness of observation error. We are collaborative participants. Third, Jung's phenomenological articulation of the self as a multiplicity, mutual nodes of embodied consciousness centered through interactivity. Fourth, Jung's insistence that we exist only in and with both the collective and nature, our earthly climate. All big offerings. First, consider this reflection on embodiment, felt intersubjectively in clinical practice, regarding what we all know, though likely in the way that Jung hints at in the dreamlike world of India. Quotes, life in India has not yet withdrawn into the capsule of the head. It is still the whole body that lives. No wonder the European feels dreamlike. The complete life of India is something of which he merely dreams. Descending from the capsule of the head is a central tenet of Jung's psychology of the transference, allowing that the Rosarium symbolism itself is but one of many amplifications, rather than to be grasped as the symbology. Overcoming defensive certitudes and knowledge and participating in the activated field of the treatment necessitates openness to Job-like encounters with numinosity disclosed in the field in which we are working. It may be overwhelming. A challenge, feeling it. Collective narratives of decimating actions abound. For instance, Jung's comments about India evoke the seemingly unending story of Britain's evisceration of India, not felt in the capsule of the head. Suspect needs were created, like drinking tea and growing opium for an export product, or India's industrialization malevolently being undone. Once the exportation of cotton from American plantations, with its hitherto accepted slavery, ended as a source of cheap cotton for Britain and its industrialized mills, Britain's India replaced the US. Although at the expense of India's existing manufacturing of cotton fabric being disassembled, any textile worker who continued to produce risked having their thumbs severed. India had to grow, export, and then re-import at exorbitant prices the cotton it had once made for itself. Parallel to this dismemberment is the infamous creation in China of a market for opium, a story recounted in a recent novel by Quang, Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an arcane history of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. What do we have to offer to this? As a Jungian, I'm compelled to reply, we do embrace dynamics, perhaps an unrealized, doctor and patient together, both participating in the bath, both suffering new substance, humbly the doctor engaging dialogically with neither objective certitude nor defensive withholding, embodied, hinting at what might be emerging, both growing out beyond Neurosis Island, a theory transcending itself. Second, we are participatory observers. Jungians also know that we are fated to experience observation error, as noted by Jung, from another standpoint, participating in another way. What we know will be different, all those minimally felt north versus south, western versus eastern, impositions onto other hemispheres, cultural, attitudinal, seasonal, geographic presumptiveness, interactive, mutual, and arising perspective transcending the familiar. The capsule of our heads professes such touchstones, embodiment forthcoming, maybe. Third, how might we connect these ideas clinically with narratives such as those of India or China, or the experiences of descendants of slaves? I contend we analysts need to ground such stories within ourselves, our resonances, to welcome such reverberations being activated, and we must make use of opportunities which abound, explicitly to raise often unexamined aspects of the patient's life. For instance, when a patient discusses employment and residence issues, surfacing how race might be a part of this, how gender preference might be an aspect, how local history might be a part of this, and how it is to talk about these things with some white guy. Typically, these concerns are known, we think them, but silently felt and not articulated, and so never meaningfully acknowledged. Inner and outer life remains minimally connected, rendering analysis false, or at least incomplete. Our failures to move toward and into action mirror such falsity. A therapist example. Ami Bedi, an Indian from India, America, therapist, grounds her work in a somatically held awareness of the South Indian goddess, Akhilandashwari, the goddess never not broken, as well as her awareness of India's and Western history as noted above. Embodying such roots of attracting or making pregnant attitude is brought into her work with patients. As immediate and transgenerational class, culture, gender, and racial tensions manifest in the patient's life, they intersect in the here and now. A gestational space arises. Something about the attitude generates the gestational space in which we as the therapist are collaborators. Put briefly, endeavoring to realize interactively mutuality, an arising, healing, empowering perspective transcending the familiar, we focus on what happens with patients within analytic trainings rather than what we do to patients or how we train analysts or how the upside down hung one is welcomed rather than abandoned by knowledge alone. Jung's extraordinary awareness of the body psyche as plural provides us with another map. We are a multiplicity of interactive complexes and self-states. Not only is one's encapsulated ego displaced, but one's organizing self is relativized, a bit like the biblical paradigm of the charisms. We work only within a collectively known sense of shared being, Ubuntu, an existential umbilicus. A final note. Theory and practice and the climate. Our work rests upon and manifests life within our shared global climate. Only within nature do we experience the interactive treatment matrix, reflections on the interrelatedness and embodied analytic work. Peter Frankopan's The Earth Transformed, an Untold History, potently situates us in our brief time in Earth's history within the long-term, ever-interactive history. Quotes, when we think of history, we conceptualize time with reference to human achievements and to events we choose to relate to. By necessity, this makes our frames of reference both highly self- and species-centered and laughably narrow. A sober assessment of many eras and much past history yields the stark reality that the sole option is the one from which we have parted company. Intentional, non-dominational, interactive working with the earth. Our dilemma is that neither do we seem to be drawn to interaction, nor to be willing to pull back from styles of living that shall doom themselves. A conclusion, an alchemical kitchen. Daily or on pilgrimage, when visiting the Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar, which has this huge ritualistic honoring at the beginning and end of each day of the Sikh scriptures carried on a palanquin and a huge procession, and this is like a big deal. And the scriptures apparently contain all known scriptures from all the different cultures. There is also the kitchen at the Golden Temple. In the kitchen, food is served, daily service. My knowledge is meaningless without action. My knowledge is useless without service. As a donation of love from one's existence, over 100,000, they say 200,000, I'm willing to cut it in half, Over 100,000 meals are served every day at this one kitchen, relying entirely on voluntary service, food preparation, serving, cleaning. Perhaps there's a model here. Theory lived. In conclusion, I at least, have far to go with appropriating the implications of the interactivity of the treatment matrix. Beyond lifting up this gestalt of our therapeutic work within clinical process, just as one might note a racial or other cultural background. So to speak, love is shown in deeds. Ubuntu is not just a head trip. Whilst honoring the Jungian scriptures, we are on the hook for creating an environmental kitchen of climate and human service. Thank you.